This is going to be new for most of you, because what I'm going to do tonight is what was done about really against our Bible, and legitimately so back in the 1800s, when people started asking the same questions about the Bible. Can we look and see whether or not these people called, well, Abraham, for instance, did he actually exist? Is there somebody, are there customs that we can look at? Are there things that actually place him in the 19th century or 1900 BC outside of the Bible that support what he said, what he did? The same thing with Moses, the same thing with David. Moses in 1400 BC, David in 1000 BC. Every religion has historical characters that live in a place, doing certain events at a certain time. Names, dates, places, and events. Those are the 4 historical questions we should ask of every book, not just the Bible. The Upanishads, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Book of Mormon, different books that are claimed to be religious books, and certainly of the Quran. So what we're going to do today is all these questions that have been asked to the Bible, now for the first time we're applying them to Islam. So let's open it up and let's talk about what we're talking about. Well, let's say the first thing that every Muslim will say is, and they all agree with this, is that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. I don't think there's any Muslim that would say any different. They would also say the Quran was his revelation sent down only to him between 610 and 632. It's the final revelation. It's the greatest revelation. It's the seal of all revelations, like Muhammad is the seal of all prophets. He is the final prophet. Therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life. Now, what's the classical account? This is the account that you've all heard. This is what you're taught in every school. This is still what is being taught in every university. It's still being taught in most every corner of the world. This is the classical account that you've only, and this is one you'll agree with. You've never heard any other story. You've all been told that Muhammad was born in 570. Has anybody heard any different? No. There's no reason not to hear any different, because that's all that we've ever heard. We also have been told that in 610, he went away from Mecca, he went to the Hira cave, which he would go there quite often to meditate, and there in the middle of while he was meditating, suddenly an angel appeared to him, Jibril, and says, Akra, that means recite. His response was, Ma'akra, I cannot recite, because he could not read or write. So the angel squeezed him, then said a second time, Akra. And his response was, Ma'akra, I cannot read or write. And he was squeezed a second time. This happened 3 times. Finally, the angel let him go, and he ran back to Mecca, went to Khadija, his only wife at that time. Khadija was the woman that was very wealthy. She had her own caravans. She employed Muhammad as her caravan leader. She married him. And she had a little test for him when he came back. She asked him to first sit on one leg and asked him, was this an angel that talked to you? He said, yes. She asked him to sit on the other leg and said, are you sure this was an angel that talked to you? He said, yes. She finally disrobed in front of him and then asked the third time, were you sure that this was an angel? And he said, yes. After that, she knew he was telling the truth, because no angel would ever be in her presence disrobed. So she went and told her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, what Muhammad had said. Waraka ibn Nawfal was a Nestorian Christian, so we're told, according to traditions. And it was Waraka ibn Nawfal that then turned to Muhammad and said, truly, what has happened to you, you have been seen by an angel. This is a revelation that is coming to him, that you are a prophet. Interestingly, it's a Nestorian Christian that gives the authority for Muhammad as a prophet, one of the ironies of history. After that happened, then many revelations started to come from 610 on, and we call these the Meccan revelations. Up from 610 to 622, he started receiving these revelations that are in the second part of the book, the latter part of the Quran. In 621, he woke up in the middle of the night, and he was told by the angel to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, which flew him up to Jerusalem. And there, at the rock, where the dome is now built, the Dome of the Rock, at that rock he then ascended to 7 heavens, met Allah. Allah said to pray 50 times a day. So he came down to the 5th heaven, met Moses, and asked him, how many times did he ask you to pray? He said, 50. That's way too many. Go back up and see if you can get it down. So he goes back up to Allah and gets it down to 45. He comes down to the 5th heaven, and Moses, see if you can get it down more. And so he bounced back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, bringing it down from 45 to 40 to 35, down to 15, 10, and finally 5 prayers. Once he got it to 5 prayers, then Moses says, fine, go on back down to earth, which he did, which is one of the another ironies of history, that the reason why Muslims pray 5 times a day is because of Moses. Isn't that fascinating? And this all happened in 621. Am I changing the story, or have you all heard this story? So far, I've kept exactly to what every Muslim will tell you. In 622 then, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina. This is called the Hijrah, the Exodus. And he moves, some of the traditions say there were 80 of his followers, others say there were 200. Nonetheless, he had a small group of men and women that he moved with, called the Hijrah. He moves up to Medina, and then the reason why he goes to Medina is because the Ansar, the natives of Medina, they were having problems with the Jews who controlled all the commerce. They needed someone who was neutral to arbitrate between them, and so that's why they brought Muhammad up. He was neutral. So he was there as an arbiter between the Ansar, the Arabs, and the Jews. Now, that arbitration happened for about 2 years. That continued for 2 years, from 622 to 624. It didn't work, because after 624, then, that arbitration broke down. He still continued to receive revelations, and these revelations continued from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life. Once these arbitrations broke down, once the Jews no longer accepted him as a prophet, he no longer accepted them. In 630 then, he goes from Medina and he just walks right into Mecca and takes it over. No war, no battle, he takes it over. And then he dies in 632. Some say he was poisoned, but what we do know is that he did die, and that's, at that time, the Quran had yet been written down. It had been memorized by many of the companions. Parts of it had been written on bones, stones, some had been written on bark, but it had not been written down completely when he died. After he died, Abu Bakr takes over. Abu Bakr rules from 632 to 634. He dies normally. Then Umar takes over, and he goes and rules from 634 to 644, the next 10 years. He then is killed. Uthman takes over, and he then rules from 644 to 656. It's during his ruling, the third caliph, his ruling, that the Quran was written down. 650 to 652 is when the Quran was finally written down, roughly 18 to 20 years after Muhammad's death. This is what the classical account says. This is what I've been taught. This is what you've been taught. This is the only story you're going to hear. And then Uthman is killed, and Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, then takes over, and he is considered to be the legitimate heir because he is adopted by Muhammad. Muhammad didn't have any heirs. He had 2 sons, but they died in childbirth. He had 4 daughters, but they could not be his heirs. And that's why Ali had to be his heir. Ali then takes over, and then he is killed at the Battle of Siffin in 661. Now, that is the story you've all heard. Have any of you heard any other story? No, I don't hear and see any hands. For a very good reason. There is no other narrative. That's the only narrative we're given. There you can see now where this is all happening. It's all happening in this red area here. From the birth of Muhammad in 570 up until the death of Muhammad in 632. Everything that took place during Muhammad's life is in that red area. Now, when should that have been written down? You would like to think it was written down, everything I've just told you, should have been written down while Muhammad was still living, or immediately afterwards, right? You would like to think so. It would make sense, because we're not talking about a time when people could not read or write. People could read or write. Listen, the Bible had been written long before this. We have a copy of the New Testament right here in London from the 4th century. This is the 7th century. 300 years earlier, they had already written the Bible down, and certainly people could read or write in this part of the world. Why? Because take a look and see what they controlled. They now controlled the central part of Arabia. These people were merchants. They should have been able to read or write. Muhammad could not, but certainly Khadijah could, his wife. And he has a secretary named Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit is his secretary. What do secretaries do? They write, don't they? By definition, he should have been able to read or write. So you would have hoped that someone could have written down all the story that I'm just telling you about in this period, or immediately after here. When do you think this story that I've just told you was written down? It wasn't written in that period at all. It wasn't written in the 7th century at all. Not even the same century that Muhammad lived. In fact, it first gets written down by this man here, Ibn Ishaq, in 765. Muhammad died in 632. But we don't have any of his material. We're dependent on this man here, Ibn Hisham, to know about what Muhammad did. We have nothing before Ibn Hisham. And look at the date when he died, 833. 632 Muhammad dies. We have no biography of Muhammad until 833. That's 200 years later. So basically what we're saying is, everything we know about Muhammad, about what he did, doesn't get written down till over here, 200 years later. What about his sayings? Al-Bukhari is the one that first writes down his sayings. Al-Bukhari is given 600,000 akhbars, 600,000 of these sayings, and he's to throw out those that were fraudulent. So he whittles them down, right down to 7,397. From 600,000, he whittles them down to 7,397. That's just 2%. He throws out 98% and only retains 2%. And when was that done? In 833. That's 240 years later. How did Al-Bukhari know what to retain? How did Al-Bukhari know what to throw out? Did he know Muhammad? No, he didn't. He lived 240 years later. Did he live in that area? No, he didn't. He lived hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. So why did it take them 240 years to write down what Muhammad said? What about the tafsir, which would be the commentaries on the Quran, which is what Muslims must need in order to know how to interpret the Quran? You have many, many tafsir. You have Al-Tabari. In fact, Al-Tabari is the first to write down a tafsir. Take a look at his date. 923. That's the 10th century. 300 years later, because Muhammad died in 632. It takes him 300 years to write the first commentaries on the Quran down. Now, there are many that write after Al-Tabari. There's Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti. The names go on and on, but they all come after 923. Nothing before 923. So basically what we're saying is everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about his life, everything we know about how the Quran was put together, everything we know about what he said that happened in this period here, does not get written down till this period, 200 to 300 years later. Does that bother any of you? Please say yes. It should bother all of you. Why? Well, can you imagine if we were to apply the same criteria to Jesus? Now, when did Jesus die? We know he died in about 33 AD. Did people write down what he did? Yes, they did. Almost immediately, didn't they? You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who wrote down the biography of Jesus. So you have the biographies written down. We know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written by between 48 and 64 AD. So within 30 to 40 years, you already have 3 biographies of Jesus. John would have been written later. That's about 60 years later. But 2 of those biographers actually knew Jesus. John and Matthew lived with him for 3 years. They saw everything he did. They heard everything he said. So they wrote down what they saw and they wrote down what they heard. We don't just have 1 biography, we have 4 biographies. 2 of them written by eyewitnesses and the other 2 who got them from the eyewitnesses. 40 to 60 years after Christ's death. What about the tafsir of Jesus? That would be the commentaries. Well, the tafsir of Jesus would be the letters of Paul. He was the one that actually commented on what Jesus did. What Jesus did, he showed how to apply what Jesus did in Ephesus, in Philippi, in Corinth. Those are the commentaries on Jesus' life. And Paul was beginning to write down within 15 years of Jesus' death. Not 300 years, but within 15 years, Paul was writing down these tafsir of Jesus. Do you see the parallels? What about the Tahrik, the histories of the early church? The book of Acts, written by Luke. And we know the book of Acts had to be written between 52 and 62 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. So within 20 to 30 years, you have the Acts of the Apostles written. Which means everything we know about Jesus is written down within 15 to 60 years while the eyewitnesses were still living. John was still living. He was the last to write something down. Whereas everything we know about Muhammad is written 200 to 300 years after the fact. Ooh my, look at the differences. That's why I love my Bible. And that's why I love the person of Jesus Christ. That's why I can trust what I know about him, because they were written down so early. And you might say, hold on a minute, the first century, that's so early. Could people read or write? Listen, these were fishermen. How did they know how to read or write? Well, Matthew wasn't a fisherman. He knew how to read or write. And John used a scribe to write for him. Luke certainly was a doctor. He knew how to read or write. And Mark knew how to read or write. Of course they knew how to read or write. And Paul, goodness sakes, he was one of the most intelligent men of his day. Of course he knew how to read or write. So why could not the Muslims, where were their Pauls, Lukes, Johns, Matthews, and Marks? Where are their readers and writers? Why could they not do the same thing in the 7th century or the 8th century? Why do we have to wait to the 9th century to have anything written down? Here's the questions. This is their concerns. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, why did it take so long to write it down? Were these people illiterate? I hear that all the time whenever I ask my Muslim friends this. They were illiterate. I said, hold on a minute. No, they weren't illiterate. By 642, within 10 years of Muhammad's death, Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo were controlled by Islam, or at least by Arabs. Those are huge cities. These had lots of libraries. They could read and write for hundreds of years, thousands of years in these cities. Please don't say no one knew how to read and write in those cities. By 685, by the time Abd al-Malik comes to power, all of North Africa, all the way from Spain in the west, in the other direction, all the way to India in the east, that whole swath of land was under their control. Are you telling me that from Spain to India, nobody could read or write? Not one person? No, of course they could read or write. In fact, they tell me that the Quran was written down by Zayd ibn Thabit in 632 to 634. Within 2 years of Muhammad's death, the Quran was first written down by a man named Zayd ibn Thabit, who was the scribe of Muhammad, the secretary of Muhammad. His whole job was to read and write. So where did the 9th century biographers get their material from? And since we don't have anything before the 9th century, can we trust it, since it's so late? Shouldn't we go back to the period these events took place? Shouldn't we go back to the 7th century and see what we find? And that's, as a historian, is what we need to do. Let's go back and see what we can find in the 7th century. And that's what now a whole slew of historians have begun to do. If when you look at the Quran, take a look at all the stories in the Quran, they just don't make sense for a 7th century environment. They make much more sense once the Muslims or the Arabs had moved out into the diaspora, where they would have come across these stories. Because these stories, actually, we know where the stories come from. Story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, Ayah 31. That comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. The story of Abraham in Surah 21, Ayah 51 to 71. A great story but it does not come from the Bible. It actually comes from the Mishnah Rabbah. The story of Solomon and Sheba in Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44. A terrific story with the hoopoe bird and the Queen of Sheba pulling up her skirts and she has hairy legs. That story does not come at all from my Bible. I don't remember her ever pulling up her skirts. Nor do I remember a hoopoe bird that could talk. Or that Solomon, who had created an entire air force that would drop stones on the enemy with the name of the enemy at the bottom of the stones. This is not in my Bible. I would have loved to have had that story in Sunday school. For one very good reason. It's from the second Targum of Esther, which was written in the 2nd century. It was nothing more than an apocryphal account written by the Jews in the 2nd century, and nothing more than as entertainment for their children. Yet you find it in Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44. They shouldn't have ever put it in the Quran. This does not come from God. It doesn't even come from His scripture. It comes from nothing more than a folk tale for children. The first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is not till 691. Muhammad died in 632. Isn't that interesting? There's no Arab reference to Muhammad earlier than 691. That's 60 years after he died. The first reference to Muslim, the word Muslim, is not till the 690s. So what did these people who were destroying and taking over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, what did they call themselves? Well, they called themselves Sarasin, which is the Arab name for these people. They call themselves Hagarim because they are in the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelite because they were in a line through Hagar down to Ishmael, so therefore they would be in that line. They call themselves Maghreb because they come from the Maghreb, and they call themselves Mahajurun. These are the names they call themselves, those 5 names. The Mahajurun means people of the Hijr, people of the Exodus, people who are nomadic. The first reference to the word Islam is not till 691 on the Dome of the Rock, there in Jerusalem. And the first reference to the city of Mecca is not till 741. Muhammad died in 632. As you know, as I already said, the first biography of Muhammad is not till 833. Now let's unpack this and let's see what we're talking about. And let's start with Dan Gibson's material. Now Dan Gibson, when he was looking at the Quran, and you can do the same thing, he wanted to find out where the geographical locations were in the Quran. And he noticed there were 65 geographical locations. 9 places are named over and over again. And the names that come up over and over again are these people from Ad. 23 times it talks about this prophet who has contact and has a relationship with these people from Ad. It doesn't mention who this prophet is. It just says the prophet, the messenger, the prophet, from the place of the prophet, from the place of the messenger. It doesn't refer to where he lives. Isn't that curious? In fact, you're not going to find reference to Muhammad. You will. There, in all the many, many references to Muhammad, take a look, you'll see they are all in parentheses, which means they've had to been put in at a later date. Muhammad's name is, in Arabic, is only found 4 times. 3 times in one surah alone. 4 times. How many times is Jesus found in the Quran? Try 93. So this messenger has contact with these people from Ad 23 times. 24 times he has contact with these people from Thamud. And 7 times for these people from Midian. Ad, Thamud, Midian, where are they? Well, they're not around Mecca. They're way up here. 600 miles further north. But here's Mecca way down here. If he's living in Mecca, how come he's having these contacts, daily contacts with people that are 600 miles away? Put that under your hat and hold it a minute. Let's talk about Mecca. See, what we now know about Mecca, it's only referenced once in the entire Quran, and it talks about the valley of Mecca in Surah 48, Ayah 24. That's it. No other time does it talk about this place. Well, what do we know about Mecca? Well, we know that there's also reference to Bakka. We don't know if that is Mecca. We know that if you look at the traditions and you add them with the Quranic material, we do know right there that it's in a valley. We know that there's a parallel valley where the Mecca is. We know that it has a stream going through it, that it has a pillar of salt outside of it, because when this prophet goes past in the morning, he passes the pillar of salt. That's the wife of Lot. And when he comes in the evening, he passes that same pillar of salt. More than that, we know that there are fields, clay, grass, trees, loam, and olive trees. That's curious. And that there are mountains overlooking the Kaaba. Now take a look at every one of these references. None of these fit Mecca. Mecca is not in a valley. There is no parallel valley. There is no stream going through it. It only has one well, the Zamzam well. It could not have accommodated any caravans. It does not have tree, fields, clay, glass, or any suggestion of any olive trees, because olive trees only exist in the Mediterranean, 600 miles further north. There are no olive trees at all in the Arab Peninsula. So, all of these geographical references make no sense for Mecca. Now, according to Islam, Mecca is probably the oldest city in the world, because according to Surah 7, Ayah 24, when Adam and Eve, when they were up in the Garden of Eden, which is up in space, when they were thrown out of that garden, they were thrown down to earth. According to the traditions, it was Mecca that they were thrown down to. So it would be the earliest sanctuary for all of mankind. We also know in Surah 21 that Abraham is in Mecca. He is there, and he goes into the Kaaba and he destroys the idols. That's in Surah 21. So in 1900 BC, Mecca should have existed if Abraham's there, right? We also know from all the traditions that Mecca was the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. That's why it became rich. That's why Muhammad was there. He was a trader. So, it's the mother of all settlements, according to Surah 692, Surah 42, Ayah 5. Adam and Eve came from there. Abraham came from there. Muhammad was born there. And it's also where the Qibla, the direction of prayer, every mosque should be facing Mecca. Correct? From 624 on, it should be the case, because we do know, according to Surah 2, ayah 145 to 149, that Muhammad, when he moved to Medina in 622, he redirected the Qibla back up to Jerusalem so that it could accommodate the Jews. After 624, the Jews would not accept him as a prophet, so suddenly he gets a new revelation in Surah 2 to redirect the Qibla back down to Mecca. So from 624 on, every mosque should be facing Mecca, right? Now, take a look at this Byzantine map of the trade route from the 7th century. What's missing? Can you find Mecca? This is a copy of a Byzantine map from the 7th century. Mecca isn't there. This is where Mecca should be, right here. It's not on the map. Here's a map of trade routes from the 7th century. These are Arab trade routes. These are not Byzantine trade routes. These are Arab trade routes. Where's Mecca? It's right where that question mark should be. When we look at the earliest maps, we can't find Mecca on any of the maps. This is the map that Patricia Corona looked at, and this is the one that got her curious. She was shown this map. This is a map that's not from the 7th century. It's a map that was made today in the 20th century, redacted back to the 7th century to show you what the place looked like. And when she looked at this map, she noticed that all the trade would have come from here in India and China further away. They couldn't go that way because of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. So all the trade used to come across the Arabian Sea over here into the Persian Gulf and used to go that direction up to the Mediterranean world. Are you following me there? The problem is that the Sassanids who were here were warring against the Byzantines who were there. So they were warring back and forth for 200 years from the 5th, 6th, and 7th century. So that shut down the trade from going up the Persian Gulf. They had to redirect the trade from India across the Arabian Sea down to here in Aden. And that's where they took off all the trade. They took it off the boat there, and they went 1,250 miles, following that green line all the way up to Gaza in the north. That's a pretty good theory. That's called the trade route theory. Montgomery Watt was the one that came up with that theory. The Muslims love it, and they've grabbed onto it, and they're still using it today. Dr. Patricia Crone looked at this map. She says, hold on a minute, you've got a problem there. Let's see if any of you can find that problem. My 10-year-old son found it within 2 minutes. I'm not going to give you 2 minutes. Can any of you see a problem with that theory right there by looking at that map? No? No one's going to try? Should I give you a hint? Water. That's a pretty big hint. Go ahead, sir. Give him a hand. He's got it. That's true. If you're on boat here and you're coming across the Arabian Sea, why would you take off all the goods here? Dr. Patricia Crone found that if you go only 50 miles by land, it would cost the same amount if you went 1,250 miles by sea. You've got a sea right up here. Why didn't they continue on sea? That didn't make any sense. So she decided to go back and check this out. Now remember, she reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back to the original sources of all the trade documents. She went to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. She went to all the centuries leading up until the 7th century, read their trading documents, looked at them in the original language, and she noticed that all the trade coming from India and China, all of it came right across the sea and went right up the Red Sea. And the Arabs had nothing to do with the trade because they did not like boats. They were camel herders. They liked the desert. That's why you don't have any ports along here. There was only one port that she could find. All the ports were on this side in Africa, and the people that controlled the trade were from this area, from Eritrea. The documents, the trading documents that she found over here had Eritrean names or Ethiopian names, African names. They were the traders, which makes a lot of sense once you look at the map. Then she noticed something else. Take a look at there. Here's the trade route, the line, the green line. It comes up to Taif. This is the Western Plateau, all the way up. And then from here in Taif, it goes off the plateau down to Mecca. There's Mecca. It's not on the plateau. It's about 1,000 meters off the plateau. They would have to go down to Mecca to go to a place that had no water, then come back up 1,000 meters to get up to Yathrib up here. Why had no one noticed that before? This is nothing new. It's been around for hundreds of years. Why did no one notice that Mecca's not on the trade route? It would have made no sense to be on the trade route. Why? Because it's too far down. It had no water. So she decided to look and see what was it that made Mecca, if it had anything that made it rich. She was told, according to the trade route theory, that it had 15 spices. And that's why it became rich. So she wrote her book, and she decided to do research on all 15 spices. And she found that none of the spices, except for 2, even came from Arabia. They either came from India and China, or they came from Africa. The only 2 spices that came from Arabia were frankincense and myrrh. And they came from the southern part, the Hadramat, this part here, which is Yemen and Oman today. Nothing about any spice from this part of the world. The only trade she could find that were going up the Western Plateau was milk and leather. You cannot create an entire empire made out of milk and leather. Now, when she came out with this book, it blew open everything we knew about Mecca. She decided, well, let's find out what people knew about Mecca. So she went to every document she could find. She found documents written here in Ctesiphon, which is way up here. That is Baghdad, right up there. It's called Ctesiphon. That's the old name. They had come down here to Yathrib, and they came across silver. They had silver mines all over Yathrib. That's not too far from Mecca. Yathrib is what is Medina today. She looked at their documents. No reference to any place called Mecca. She couldn't find any reference from the 1st century, from the 2nd century, from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, from the 7th century. No reference to Mecca. So when did she find Mecca? Not till 741. 741. Muhammad died in 632. She couldn't find any reference to Mecca earlier than 741. That's over 100 years later. So what is this city? Where is this place that Adam and Eve were sent down to? Where is this Kaaba that supposedly Abraham rebuilt with Ishmael? In fact, she found out, not just Hitti found this out, in almost every one of those oases, in Najran, in Sana, in Taif, in Yathrib, in Tabuk, in Khaybar, all of these oases had Kaabas. It was quite normal to have a Kaaba. You have a Kaaba with gods in it, idols in it, then when the merchants would come along, they would go and pray to their idol, and you would get money for it. It was a great way to enrich yourself. There wasn't just one Kaaba. There were many, many Kaabas. Why hadn't anybody noticed this before? Well, take a look at modern Mecca today. Maybe you've seen this picture. Look what they're doing to Mecca. Here is Muhammad's house, where he grew up, where he was born. They're now destroying his house. Here is Khadija's house, where his wife grew up. They're now destroying her house. Why are they destroying these houses? And why are they cementing it all up? Any idea? Folks, can you see what's happening as we speak? Muslims all over the world are upset. But the Saudi Arabian government is continuing. They're going to build 62 of these buildings all around the Kaaba, so that all the rich Muslims can have air conditioning when they come to do the Hajj. That's their reasoning for it. You can see why. Mecca did not exist before 741. It's too late. So if Mecca didn't exist before 741, what are you going to do with the Qibla, the direction of prayer? Every Muslim must pray towards Mecca. Am I correct? And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you always pray towards Mecca, towards that building right there, the Qibla. In Surah 2, Ayah 143 and 145, the direction of the Qibla was then redirected down to Mecca. That would be in 624, the date they give. But here's the problem. Archaeologists are having a difficulty. As early as 1905, 2 archaeologists, one called Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fedavadi, in 1905, were traveling in that part of the world. You can't go there anymore, but back then you could. And they were looking for the earliest mosques, and they wanted to go to find these mosques that were in the 7th century. So they went to mosques, one mosque in Wasit and another mosque in Kufa, which is in what is today Iraq. And they started digging down to the different layers till they got to the original floor plan of these 2 mosques. And when they found the original floor plan of both Wasit and Kufa, they noticed the Qibla was not facing Mecca. It was facing directly west. When they went to Egypt, outside Egypt is Fustat, the garrison town. When they went to the mosque in Fustat, just outside of Cairo, when they dug down to its original floor plan, they noticed that the Qibla was facing east. It should have been facing south. It should have been facing down here. But Kufa and Was were facing that direction. Fustat was facing this direction. If the earliest mosques that we've been able to find are facing west and east and not south, then it looks like we have a different Qibla. Jacob of Edessa in 705 also said that the Qiblas. So from all this it is clear that it is not to the south that the Jews in the Maghreb is the name for the Arabs at that time, in the regions of Syria prayed, but towards Jerusalem. He thought it was Jerusalem as well. He was actually wrong. Dr. Dan Gibson decided to pick up this argument. He had read about it. He'd heard about the debate I had had on it. He also knew about that this was a problem. He saw also that there was a problem. So he decided to do something that no one else had done. He decided to look at all the earliest mosques, but you can't go to the earliest mosques today and see where the Qibla is because they are all facing Mecca. Every mosque is facing Mecca, anywhere in the world. So he decided to use satellite technology to look down from space, to look and see where the original floor plans for all these mosques were. And guess what he found? When he looked at the great mosque in Guangzhou in China in 630, it's facing Petra, not Mecca. When he looked at the great Humayma Mosque, southwestern Jordan, the Qibla is facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. The great mosque at Baalbek in Lebanon, it's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. When he went to the great mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, the capital city of Yemen, right at the very bottom of the peninsula, built in 705. Now look at the date. All the Qiblas were supposed to be canonized in 624. So every mosque after 624 should be facing Mecca. But here's one built in 705, and it's facing Petra, not Mecca. This is an interesting one. This is in Jerusalem. Now you have the Dome of the Rock right here. That's the beautiful Dome of the Rock. Here you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque here. The Dome of the Rock is built in 691. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is built in 709. Look at the entire citadel, including both the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa, are all facing Petra. 691, 709. The entire citadel is facing Petra, the third most holy shrine in Islam. The Damascus Mosque, built in 709, it's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon, look at the date, 714. It's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. The Mosque of Umar in Basra, now we're in Syria, 720. We're almost 100 years later. If the Qibla had its canonization in 624. This is 720. Almost 100 years later, it's still facing Petra, not Mecca. It's not till 727 that they finally found a mosque in Pakistan, Banbor in Pakistan, facing Mecca instead of Petra. This is over 100 years later. But then in 728, here you find a Qibla in the Qasr al-Khayr al-Sharqi in Syria. It's not facing Petra or Mecca. Looks like they're a little confused on this one. Now here's what's interesting. Take a look at this mosque from Amman in Jordan. This is the older mosque built in 700. It's facing Petra. They then rebuilt another mosque behind it and above it in 740. It now is facing Mecca the right way. So what happened between 700 and 740? That's the question we need to ask. The Mushata Mosque in Amman, now we're in 743. It's back to Petra again. This is 120 years later. The Rabat, now when we get to North Africa, they don't seem to know where to face. Because in Tunisia, here's a fortress in Susa, Tunisia, in 770, it's not facing Petra or Mecca, it's facing directly south. They're a little confused in North Africa. The same way in Spain. Take a look at Spain. There's Petra, there's Mecca, it's facing quickly south. Obviously, there's something that we need to find out about North Africa and Spain as to why they're completely miscued. The great mosque in Karaoun in Tunisia in 870. Now we're into the 9th century. See, these are much later mosques. In the 9th century, there seems to be some type of confusion here, because they're not facing Petra or Mecca. It's facing straight south again, much like you found in other North Africa. But take a look at these. Were up until 725, excuse me. Up until 725, every Qibla was facing Petra. And what's interesting is they were all uniformly facing Petra. I've heard Muslims try to say, well, they didn't know their direction at that time. Listen, these were camel herders. They went through the deserts. There were no roads in the deserts. And even the paths they used to take would be covered over by a sandstorm. So how did they know where to go? They used the stars. They were brilliant at knowing direction. Otherwise, they would have died. You can't tell me they did not know where Petra was or where Mecca was. The fact that they're all facing Petra until 725 shows me. So from 622 to 725, every mosque he looked at was uniformly 100% facing Petra. Between 725 and 822, there seems to be a confusion. There seems to be something going on. We don't know what it is yet. But there was still backers and forings, especially in North Africa. They didn't know where to go. So 12% of the mosques were facing Petra. 50% started now to face Mecca. 38 were parallel or in other directions. And it isn't till 822 that every mosque begins to face Mecca. That's 200 years later. It takes them 200 years to get every mosque facing Mecca. Now we should ask, why is it that no one's known that before? That to me is hugely troubling. So why Petra? Well, take a look where Petra is. Remember that Arab trade route? I showed you where Petra, it's in the center of all the trade. See, Mecca's not even on the trade route map for one very good reason. There was no trade that went through Mecca. But Petra is on the center of every route. What is Petra known for? How many people have been to Petra? Has anybody been there? Okay, one man, two. What do you notice about Petra? It has tombs and temples. It was a center of the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabateans, we know about the Nabateans. They existed from the 2nd century BC. They existed, in fact, it's the Nabatean kingdom that we get the name Allah. Allah is a Nabatean god. The black stone that's in the Kaaba comes from Petra. What's more, Arabic, the language Arabic comes from Nabatean script. They are the precursors to the Arabs. And yet all of their mosques and all of their temples all around the world were facing Petra up until 725. Let's take a look at Petra even closer. Look at Petra. It's in a valley. It has a parallel valley. It has a stream going right through it. It has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam. It has olive trees. It's near this. If there was ever a pillar of salt that Lot's wife would have been, it would have been close to Petra, because that's exactly where that event took place. Petra has all the items listed above from the Quran and the Islamic traditions. Everything that we see in the Quran and the Islamic traditions fit Petra. None of them fit Mecca. Thus, could it be Petra that all these places were referring to? What's more, take a look at Ad, Thamud, Midian. Remember the people that are referred to in the Quran over and over again? 23 times these people from Ad, 24 times the people from Thamud, 7 times from people from Midian. Take a look and see where they are. They're all around Petra. They lived right around Petra. No wonder whoever was writing or whoever was coming in contact with these people, they were living, whoever that person was, that messenger, that prophet, was living 600 miles further north. Not in Mecca. Mecca's way down here. 600 miles between the two. So what's the significance? And this is what we need to unpack today. We don't know anything about Muhammad at all in the 7th century. Now, we do know from outside sources. We do have this from extra Quranic sources. We do have references to Muhammad. The Doctrina Iacobi, which is right here in the British Library, written in 634, refers to him by name. But it doesn't say where he's from. It doesn't say what he does. It just warns people, be careful of this man Muhammad. The writings of Sabaeus, written in 660, do talk about Muhammad and warn the Christians to be careful of him. But it doesn't place him in any place nor does it give him much significance, other than the fact that he was a man who did an awful lot of warring. What's interesting is the earliest documents we can find from within Arab sources, from within Muslim sources, the Maghazi documents, which are the earliest part of the Siratul Rasulullah, written by Ibn Hisham in 833. The earliest documents that Ibn Hisham was dependent on are the Maghazi documents. The Maghazi documents means raids. He was a raider. That's what he did. Now can you understand that even his biography from 624 to 632 are about raid after raid after raid after raid. He was involved in 29 raids himself, and he planned another 39 according to his own traditions. That fits the man that we're talking about. It fits the historical character. But nowhere does it say that we can find of these raids being way down in Mecca. It looks like they must have been much further north. His biography doesn't even appear till the 9th century. His city doesn't appear till the 8th century, 741. Thus, much of what we know of Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like he is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly Abdul Malik. So Humphrey's conclusions: Islam in the Prophet's life as we know it was not derived from the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years and redacted back onto the Prophet's life and compiled in the 9th century. So, here's the million-dollar question. What really happened? Now, I have to be careful because this is what I think. I may change tomorrow. I may have a complete different scenario in 1 year because we're now getting lots of material that's coming in. But this is where I think, this is what I believe. This is just me. This is what I think happened looking at everything that we've got so far. And this is a what-if scenario, okay? To make sense of all this, I think we need to go back to Abdul Malik. And this is what it's not just me saying this is what almost all the historians are saying. You need to start with Abdul Malik, who ruled Islam from 685 to 705. He was the second caliph amongst the Marwanid caliphs. Marwan came into power in 680. Before that was Sufyan family from 661 up until 680. So for the first 20 years of the Umayyad Caliphate, it was a Sufyani family. Marwan finally takes over. Marwan's son, Abdul Malik, is the great Arab reformer. He is known as the great Arab reformer. You can see the Arabs control that part of the world. Therefore, by the time he comes to power, they had controlled that part from 642. So for 40 years, they had now controlled that part of the world, the central part, the area where Jerusalem is, where Damascus is, where also Petra is, also where Mecca and Medina would be. For 40 years, however, they did not control it. They were nothing more than nomads. These nomads that went and took over the Sassanid Empire and then took over the Byzantine Empire. Remember that map I showed you? Remember, those two empires were much more sophisticated. They were empires that had huge cities. The nomadic Arabs did not have big cities. They were nomads. They just had little oases. Therefore, they didn't know how to run cities. That's the first question we should have been asking. How could a nomadic people have such sophisticated rules and regulations dealing with so huge metropolitan areas? Unless, of course, these rules and regulations come much later. Remember that map that we have of the Sassanid Empire? They had two groups, the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, that they would pay to keep the Arabs in the desert. The Ghassanids were paid by the Byzantines, and the Lakhmids were paid by the Sassanians, the Persians. And as long as they got paid, these groups kept the nomads in the desert. But after 200 years of warring with each other, the Sassanids against the Byzantines, they ran out of money. This is well known. Once they ran out of money, they no longer played the Ghassanids, and they no longer played the Lakhmids. And so therefore, the nomadic Arabs could just move right into these empires. And they did. This is well known. This happens all the time. The Mongols did it much later. The Visigoths did it in Europe. Barbarians who come into much more sophisticated environments. What happens when barbarians take over sophisticated environments? They don't know how to run cities. The Arabs didn't know how to run any of these cities. So what did? They stayed outside the cities. They built garrison towns. But someone had to run these cities. Who would they have chosen? Well, they chose people like them. People who also came from Abraham, but not through Ishmael, through Isaac. Cousins, Jews and Christians. who did know how to live in cities. And they were also very literate, and they were also very academic. And that's why they used the Jews and Christians to run the cities for them, because they were cousins of Abraham, people of the book, Al-Kitab. What's more, these people, because they were so close to them, then took on a status called Mauli or Moali. This is well known, that they took on like an indentured status. They could not actually be Muslims unless they converted, but there was no such idea of Muslim at this time. There was no name of people called Muslim. There was no religion called Islam. We don't have those references until 690. So for 40 years, these Arabs were dependent on the Jews and Christians to run everything for them. Now, what happens after 40 years? You can see the problem. By the time Abdul Malik comes to power, he realizes that there is no Arab identity. He needed an Arab identity. You want to create your own identity. It's very clear that the Arabs did not have a prophet. It's very clear that the Arabs did not have a book like the Jews and Christians had. They had a whole line of prophets. They had whole slews of books, 66 books. Nothing in the line of Ishmael. But you're the ones that now control the world. You control all these Jews and Christians. So we know, and this is well known, that Abdul Malik is known as the great Arab reformer. He's the one that introduces Arabic as the international language. He is the one that introduces this Arab identity. This is well known. We can see that because when you look at Abdul Malik, take a look at the coins, and they're right here in the British Museum. Look at the coins. So the coins that the Byzantines had were the emperor with two retainers on either side, and then they would have an orb with the Byzantine cross. On the back side is the Byzantine cross. When the Arabs took over, they had to keep the same coinage so they could still continue having commerce with all the people in that type of the world. But what they did is they took off the Byzantine emperor and they put the caliph here. So this is the caliph with two retainers. No longer is there an orb with a cross. You notice. The back side still looks like a cross, but it's missing the cross piece. So no one would confuse that this is a cross to make it Arab. All right? But how can you have images of caliphs on the back of coins? Are Muslims allowed to have images anywhere? These are the coins that are introduced by the Umayyads, the first Muslims, supposedly, right? Coins, every caliph had their image on their coin. Until you get to Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik first introduces himself with an image. But then he takes it off and he introduces these coins. In 691. In 691, he introduces coins with only Arab script. He takes off the image and introduces an Arab script. And take a look what's on that coin. For the first time, you see the Shahada. That's the first time we see the Shahada. I lie. It's the second time we see the Shahada. The first time we see the Shahada is on the Dome of the Rock. Who is the one that builds the Dome of the Rock? It's Abdul Malik. The Dome of the Rock is considered to be the third most holy shrine in all of Islam, right? Am I correct on that? Ask any Muslim why the Dome of the Rock is built, and they will tell you, well, that's where Muhammad went to the seven heavens. Remember I said that earlier tonight, right? That's the story that happens in 621. It's called the Miraj, and it's to commemorate that event, which means that building should have some reference to that occasion, right? Take a look at the Dome of the Rock. Look where it's situated. See, Abdul Malik does not live in Jerusalem. He does not live in Medina. He lives in Damascus. Why in the world does he not live in Mecca? If that's the seat of the world, if that's where God is, why doesn't he have his capital in Mecca? Or at least in Medina? He's way up in Damascus, about 1,000 miles further north. But then he comes to Jerusalem in 691 and builds this large building. The Dome of the Rock. Take a look where it is. Here is the Church of the Sepulchre, which is the center of Christianity at that time. The Dome of the Rock is built on the other valley, across the valley from it, and higher up. He builds it higher up so it has ascendancy. It's bigger than the Church of the Sepulchre. It's the biggest building of its kind. Basically what he's doing is, we are now the rulers. We are now greater than you Christians. We now have the biggest building of our time in 691. And then what does he do on the inner ambulatories? This is the only part of the building. So he uses Byzantine architecture to build the building, much larger than and more prominent than any other Christian building, in the holiest city for Jews and Christians. That's why it's not in Damascus or Mecca. But it's supposed to refer to the Miraj. But take a look at the inscriptions. Now, remember, just to remind you, the Dome of the Rock has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. All right, so the dome that we're looking at today is not the original dome. The only original part of the dome that still exists today are these two inner ambulatories in the middle, in the center. These two colonnades right here. That and that. Those are the only part of the dome that is from the original building. All right? So you need to look at the inscriptions on those inner ambulatories. And when you look at those inscriptions, take a look at them and you will see there's nothing at all about the Miraj. There's nothing at all about Muhammad going up to the seven heavens, coming back down to heavens, meeting Moses and going back and forth between Allah and Moses, or 50 prayers. Yet that's why Muslims tell us the building was built. So what's on those inscriptions? Well, take a look. Surah 1:12. There is no God but God. He is one. He has no associate. Who's that against? Jesus. Say, He is God, the one, God, the eternal beside of all. He begetteth not, nor was begotten. Who is that against? Jesus, the begotten Son. And there is none comparable unto him. Muhammad is the messenger of God. Here you see Muhammad's name introduced. This is the first time Muhammad's name is introduced on any Arab inscription or architecture. This is the beginning of the introduction of Muhammad. And it's on the Dome of the Rock. In contradistinction to who? To Jesus. If you want to find out why Abdul Malik built that building and why he made it higher than the Church of the Sepulchre and across the valley on the highest point of Jerusalem, just look at the inscriptions. He's now introducing his own prophet, greater than Jesus. His name is Muhammad. He is the messenger of God. So if you're going to create an identity, you've got to have your own prophet. Because so far they've been dependent on all the Jews and Christian prophets. That's why 19 of the prophets that are listed in the Quran all come through Isaac. Where is the prophet that comes through Ishmael? Only Ishmael's name is there. They need a prophet to create that identity. They build a building, they introduce his name, and then they put it on the coins. Significance? He is the one that introduces this identity, beginning with the Dome of the Rock in 691. It's larger than any other non-Arab structure. It's facing the Arab sanctuary, Petra. It incorporates inscriptions against Byzantine Christianity. It introduces their faith. This is the first time we see the name Islam on the Dome of the Rock. It introduces their people. This is the first time we see reference to Muslims. And it introduces their prophet. This is the first time we see a reference to Muhammad. Isn't that interesting? But this is 60 years after Muhammad died. 60 years later, these three are introduced on the Dome of the Rock. More than that, the Caliphal protocols. So these are the protocols, these are the official documents written by the caliphs from the Sufyani period all the way up into the Marwanid period. And he noticed that every one of these official documents always began with the Bismillah. But it's not the Bismillah we know today. Bismillah, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim is not there. It's a completely different Bismillah. What's more, it doesn't talk about Muhammad. There's no reference in any of these caliphal protocols about people called Muslims, about a religion called Islam, about a prophet named Muhammad, or about a book called the Quran. Missing in all these protocols. Yet these are supposedly the first Muslim protocols by the caliphs, the first Muslim caliphs. This continues right up until Abdul Malik. And then he comes across Abdul Malik's protocols. And then he noticed in 691, almost overnight, Muhammad's name is introduced. It happens overnight. His name is introduced, the Quran is introduced, the name Muslim is introduced, and so is the name Islam. This is all introduced overnight in 691 and in 692. And from that time on, every protocol starts with the Bismillah and the Shahada, that there is only one God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Then he mints coins in 692, and that's where he takes off his image and introduces the Shahada on those coins that I showed earlier. Once he introduces Muhammad, he then needs a revelation. See, every prophet has to have a book, has to have a revelation. And that's why the earliest Quranic texts are on the Dome of the Rock. That's the first time we see Quranic texts. It's on the Dome of the Rock. But it does not equate with the Quran that we have today. The earliest Quranic manuscripts begin to appear during his reign and his son Al-Walid. None of them are complete, nor do they parallel today's Quran completely. They continue to be changed and corrected up until the 9th century. The sanctuary Petra is then destroyed in an earthquake in 713. What happens whenever a sanctuary is destroyed? Well, as the people know, whenever their sanctuary is destroyed, that means God no longer has favor with that sanctuary. You've got to change your sanctuary, because this is God's way of saying, this no longer is my sanctuary. Because earthquakes always come from God back then. So where are you going to change it to? Well, you're going to go back to where the Marwanids came from. The Marwanid family comes from the Hijaz, from Central Arabia. So they then bring it down and they introduce it in Mecca. That's why Mecca was chosen. It looks like Mecca was a pagan, probably a Nabatean pagan shrine that they took over, kept the practices that were still there, and tried to infuse some theological meaning. But it doesn't make sense when you look and see who God is and what He has done historically. So they chose Mecca. Now that the Muslims have a prophet, Muhammad, and they have a revelation, the Quran, now they got a revelation and a prophet, they need a sanctuary, so they choose Mecca. Now that they have the three ingredients, they now need to have a history. You've got to create a history. You've got to put Muhammad in his own place. You've got to put him in his own milieu. Now can you see why it took them for another 100 years to finally get that together? By the time they get the Sirah in 833 and the Hadith in 870, they also need to have rules and regulations. Take a look when all four schools start to appear. The Hanafi school, the Maliki school, the Shafi school, the Hanbali school. They all begin to appear in 820 and later. Nothing before 820. That's the 9th century. 200 years later and hundreds of miles away. Why? Because now the laws have to be created. And that's why they borrowed right, left, and center from Roman law and also from Sassanid law, Persian law. And then once you get that, then you've got to make sense of the Quran. By that time, the Quran is formed, but it is full of contradictions. Just take a look at the Quran, borrowing from many different sources. If you borrow, you've got to make sense of it. That's why the tafsir had to be created. And the tafsir do not start to begin to appear until the 10th century, 300 years later. By the 9th century, they now have the book, the man, the place, and the story. All four. But that's 200 to 300 years too late. So, what about Muhammad? Since much of what we know about early Islam is now in doubt, since nothing is known of Muhammad until the late 7th century, or Mecca until the 8th century, or his history until the 9th century, hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away, can we conclude that Islam is nothing more than a later redaction possibly begun by Abd al-Malik, then continued on by his descendants, al-Walid and others, proving Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran? So, who is he? And what is his purpose? They've got the wrong man at the wrong place, doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. What about Jesus? We know where Jesus was born. That's pretty clear, in Bethlehem. We know where Jesus grew up, in Nazareth. We know where he died, in Jerusalem. We know what he did especially for the last 3 years. We know from eyewitness accounts, Matthew and John. We know from hostile accounts. Look at Thallus, Tacitus, and Josephus. They are the ones that tell us about the crucifixion. They are the ones that give us his name. Thallus and Phlegon were debating about the crucifixion in 52 AD. These were Greek historians. These were not Christians. And they mentioned that when Jesus died, 20 years earlier, because 52 AD is just 20 years after the crucifixion. Within 20 years, they were debating the fact that when he died, the sun went dark and the earth shook. That's a Greek historians. Tacitus, who had nothing good to say about Christianity, he hated Christians. Yet he's the one that says that this Jesus died during the time of Pontius Pilate under the rule of Tiberius. In 33 AD. That's why we know that he died in 33 AD, because of Tiberius, the historian, writing at the end of the 1st century. So there's a Roman historian giving us reference to Jesus. What about a Jewish historian like Josephus, the greatest historian of his age, writing in Rome? He says in the early 2nd century, he talks about Jesus. He even mentions the brother of Jesus, mentions about the death of Jesus, and mentions about the death of his brother James. And then curiously, he also happens to mention that the Christians believe that Jesus rose again. The only reference we have to the resurrection from an outside a biblical source comes from Josephus, a Jewish historian. So there you have a Greek historian, you have a Roman historian, you have a Jewish historian, all talking about Jesus and his death. That's why we know, and we can be sure of what he died and where he died. No doubt about his historicity. Thus we have the right man at the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. That's why I love my Jesus.
الله ندعوك أن تأتي في وسطنا تملأنا